Betty, tell us about your French Acadian background, where you grew up. It sounds so fascinating.
Well, I grew up in an area of Maine that people who haven't traveled in that area wouldn't necessarily get there because Route 1 doesn't come to Madawaska, which is the most northern town in Maine. And it was established just prior to the Revolutionary War by ousted Acadians that had been originally settled in what we know today as Nova Scotia. They eventually ended up in the St. John Valley along the river and were granted land from the king in lots by the oldest son and the male, the father of the family, were given, I believe it was at least 90 acres each. So I descend from, on both sides of the family, the Thibodeau line, which still owns and has family ties to the original lands. In 1847, the boundary separating the United States and Canada was firmly established by the river. Back when the Acadians settled there, it was Canada. And more than 3 generations went by before that boundary got settled. So when it happened, part of my family was on one side of the river and the other on the American side or the Canadian side, and they didn't change their nationality. The land was more important to them. So I could go on, but I think I'd like
Well, we'd like to hear about the influence of your French Acadian language. Now,
Yes, that's an interesting point. I have lost my French accent. I don't hear it in my voice, except if I get overly excited, I might, you know.
What would you say if you were overly excited? Give me an example.
Well, we never said oui for yes. We always said ouais, ouais, c'est vrai.
That's interesting.
Yes, there were colloquialisms that were used on the American side of the river, and the Canadian side of the river had their colloquialisms, more Quebecois accents. This was a French culture, so everyone spoke that language.
You speak French then?
Yes, and English was second as a language. My parents raised us to be bilingual in the home. So when I started school at age 5, I was one of 2 people in the classroom who could speak English. Everyone else spoke French. And I can still remember the day.
You could speak to them, the French ones?
You could not speak French
in school. Oh, but you had
to
speak English in school.
Right.
Okay.
And at the time, of course, it was quite, it was severe, really, but not really understanding why this was the rule until later did I discover that the reasoning for it was the funding came from, you know, federal and state dollars, and the school had to be in English and not French. So the students were taught with face cards and really wrote, this is a cat, and repeating the word over and again. Mm-hmm. So it was quite interesting. In that first few months, you couldn't speak, think of it, you couldn't speak your language until you left the school ground.
Oh, even out on the school grounds?
Yeah, out on the school ground, you had to not speak the language. So I really felt bad for those kids that couldn't speak English until toward the end of the year, because they went home and spoke French at home, so they didn't get English again until they came back to school. That doesn't exist anymore there in the community. It's really much more bilingual. Students speak English at home. I don't think there's families that don't know both languages now, parents included.
So now you said it was like a French Acadian community. What would be some differences from an American community?
Well, for generations, it was almost like you consider island communities where you have generations of the same families living and not much immigration coming through. It was a valley surrounding the river at that point, at the most northern tip of the state. So unless you had business there, you didn't get off Route 1 and drive down to the river areas. It was potato farming and lumbering that were the industry.
Is that still the same now?
It still is the same in some regard. The paper industry is not as fluid as it was. This is a Canadian-owned company. Again, it's Canadian. The relationship between the two countries there are like the line isn't there. It's so, the culture is so interspersed. All the farmland in the community is potatoes. And
do you like potatoes? Do you eat a lot?
I do. I love potatoes. In fact, when my husband met me, he was thrilled. I knew all about potatoes, and he was sure to get his fill of potatoes.
So how did the French Acadians fix their potatoes? Any different?
Well, what I know about their culture is mainly the buckwheat that they grew and the fishing. I don't know, in the history that I've come upon, the potato being one of the main features. That didn't come until later.
Well, now, what are some of the influences of food and family recipes and music in your life, being raised in this very unique culture? So your food and things would probably be different.
Right. And
lots of potatoes, huh?
Yes. The food and family were very intermixed. You had relatives who enjoyed eating and also cooking. So if you had an uncle or aunt drop by, usually cooking was involved in that visit. They would talk about recipes and then immediately get up and try it. So it was fun, and especially in that time period when I was growing up, Sundays were the day for family, and so you always saw cousins, and that's usually when we went to my grandparents, and a lot of cousins would also be there. And
sounds fun.
Singing, and there was pianos.
Did you sing in French or English?
Both. Christmas time you sang in French, and
so
we didn't have.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So musically, we all played the piano. Some played by ear. I didn't. I took lessons, and then later, when I became a teenager, I took up the clarinet, E-flat clarinet. It turned out that my father was responsible for getting the music program established in our community, and it became a well-recognized band. We were honored by being selected to be the state official band.
Oh, really?
My freshman
From
year
this
in
little
high
tiny
school.
place?
Yes. We were in a competition and statewide and won. So for that year, if there was any event that needed a marching band or a symphony band, we went and did our performance.
Oh, exciting.
Yes. So I was able to, with that experience, I was able to meet then candidate Kennedy and shook his hand.
Where were you? Were you in Maine?
I was in Maine. He had come to Loring Air Force Base, an appearance to meet the the Air Force crew there and some of the members of the community, and we played for him. And then he came down off the plane, and Jackie stayed up. She was pregnant at the time, and he came down and walked in front of us, and anyone who wanted to shake his hand, he let us shake his hand. So I was so impressed with it, I didn't wash my hand for a week. But anyway.
Did you wear special uniforms for the band?
Yes, we had uniforms.
What did they look like?
They were blue and white. We had white pants. We had white.
How'd you keep your pants clean?
Well, after each performance, you were responsible for having it dry cleaned.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Yes, and it was woolen. The paper company paid for the uniforms.
That's good. They'd be expensive.
Yes, they supplied them, and that was, yes, that was. And our in the music field, with the instrument I played, I was able to participate in the state band, which was, again, you had to audition to perform, and that was nice. And I also went to music camp in the summertime, and I enjoyed that very much.
Sounds wonderful. Did you have little hats for your uniforms too, or?
We had hats. They were, I forget, just a visor with a.
Did you stay overnight when you went on these trips?
Depending. If it was to perform in a community, we were usually housed by the band members that lived there, and they opened their homes to us, so we would stay with local residents.
That sounds nice.
Yeah.
So did they want to speak French to you, or?
No. In fact, that was where I noticed I came from a different community, where there was nobody speaking French in these areas where I was going with my music experience. So I knew I came from something different than.
How'd that make you feel?
I thought it was great, really, that I could speak both languages.
Oh, I do too. Now, you're an accomplished genealogist, researcher, writer, and you've been involved in over 30 publications. Of all the things you've been involved in, would you like to tell us some of your projects and books and what has meant the most to you? Because that's a big repertoire.
Yes. Well, I love books from the start. And at one point in my life, I said, there's so many books out there, why can't I write one? So I looked at what I could do well, and I liked sewing and crafts, so I designed a crocheted horse with all of his paraphernalia.
Oh my word, how big was the horse?
Oh, about 6 feet high, not 6 inches tall, and about this wide.
And all crocheted?
All crocheted.
How did you make him stand up?
Well, it was three-dimensional. It was stuffed like you would.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it had its bridle and saddle and.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And you designed this yourself?
Yes, and I submitted it to Workbasket magazine, so they accepted it. That's a little magazine. I think it might still be out, but it was mostly crafts, knitting, and crocheting. So that led me into, okay, I can do this, and I did a few others of those. But then genealogy came into my life from a result of a 60th wedding celebration that my uncle and aunt had. All the family got together, and 3 of the daughters from that family did a tree with as far as they could trace, and that really fascinated me. So that's what hooked me into genealogy. That's prior to computers. So I started asking questions to the relatives on my mother's side of the family, because what they had done was on my father's side. So this led to, well, I love food, let's do something with the food. And
so you went from crafts to food then?
I did. I went from crafts to food. And with our love of books, my husband and I both loved collecting books, and I was at a book fair walking along, and there on one of these displays was my high school French teacher with a series of bilingual texts. And so we got to talk, and he wanted to know what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm kind of working on a family recipe collection. So he said, well, I think that you need to do this for us. It needs to be done for schools.
Now, what
So
was the project you were doing? Bilingual?
I was just doing a cookbook for our
Oh.
family.
Oh, okay.
And so
But it became bilingual.
it became bilingual, and it became a school teaching tool in the state of Maine. And the publication was published in 1981, and within a month they had sold out all of what they had printed.
Oh, that's amazing for a first time like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was. I guess a French descendant that wrote an article for the Boston Herald newspaper did a feature story on the book, and
Oh,
that
really?
just reached out everywhere. And lo and behold, they had to print another edition, and this was done through the Department of Humanities. They had grant money to help with bilingual education. So when their grant funding ended, the University of New Hampshire took on they wanted to continue my book. So they did a reprint, a second edition, and it took on a different face. But at that point, it's amazing what happened with my food experience. I did a television program. I did
What kind of cooking show? Or
a cooking show in French.
where did it?
Bonjour.
Where was it from? What?
In New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire.
We were in New Hampshire at the time.
Oh, give us your introduction. What would you say when you came on the screen each time?
Bonjour, comment ça va? And then I'd start, aujourd'hui, on va cuire des ploys, and it was the ploys that I made. That was an
Oh, I
Acadian
read about that,
French.
yeah.
Our Acadian
Could you
bread.
tell for posterity what that is?
Yes. That is uniquely Acadian. It's a bread substitute that we ate, and there was always some out on the table. There was made in the morning and made at the end of the day with buckwheat and flour. And the buckwheat was from seed that the Acadians had brought from Acadia that they preserved. And there is one farm today.
So they've kept that going all those years.
They kept it going all those years.
That's really something.
Yes.
Now, I understand that the Daughters of the American Revolution is very important to you. Why is that, and what can you tell us about your ancestor?
Well, the Daughters is important to me because I see how the service to the community and to the schools to help teach children about our history is important. And I was exposed to it when I was a president we were in Durham, New Hampshire at the time, and my neighbor next door was a member. I had seen many books in the libraries about DAR with genealogy, so I thought that's all that DAR was about, and that's far from it. So you have to do some genealogy to get in, but after that it's really a service organization, which I feel
That's
strongly
really true,
about.
it is.
Mhm.
Now, tell us about your patriot, his name. And
His name is Joseph Doobie, and I was proud to find him. It, again, was a challenge. How was I going to find a patriot when all of my ancestors were in Canada? And I discovered that there was a large contingent of Canadians that came and helped with our American cause.
so he was actually from Canada?
He was, and he was recruited by one of his cousins, and the 2nd Continental Regiment out of Quebec. He was with the Hazen Regiment. He fought at, he stayed here and helped almost 10 years before returning home. Valley Forge, New York. He did a lot in New York, went into the Southern Campaign. And yeah, I was quite impressed with him, and his relatives as well all helped with the American Revolution.
Tell us about his relatives, that's interesting.
Well, his cousin Basile Doobie, which would have been a son of one of his uncles, He was a big recruiter and a spy, and
A spy? Where did he spy?
I can't go into it here, but
Oh, okay.
yeah. How I was able to even find him as being part of my ancestor is that, one lady, I think if I remember her name, Virginia DeMarcy, did a thesis on Canadians who fought in the American Revolutionary War, and I came upon that book in the library, and it was an index from A to Z, and so I went through it and found, I knew where the family was living, what communities they were living, and the names, so that's how I went ahead. Then I went to the records.
This has been a process, a little at a time.
Definitely. It took me a while. It took me a few years before I was able to get it done, because I was doing a lot of other things, so I would do a little of this and then...
Well, let's hear about some of your other books, because obviously that isn't all 30 projects that you were in.
No.
What were some of the other things?
I guess the other biggest project, it took me 8 years. This last one that I worked on had to do with the history of the Pribilof Islands, which is a set of islands in the Bering Sea about 300 miles out from mainland Alaska. And
now, what got you interested in that? That's quite a ways from where you were.
I was hired by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to be a researcher to look in their library collection, the National Archives, anywhere and everywhere, to find materials that related to that island community. When Alaska was purchased in 1867, the Pribilof Islands at that time was a fur industry that had been started by the Russians. And just by having that as part of the purchase of Alaska, 2 years went by and the Treasury Department had their expense for purchase of Alaska just from the fur seals. They monitored a fur industry from these islands. St. Paul and St. George were the two main islands. And so my task was to find any documents. I started really creating a bibliography and maps. Maps were important because an environmental restoration project was going on. Mm-hmm. Back in 1980, the fur sealing stopped. There was no more harvest of the fur. And
just clear up till 1980?
Clear until 1980.
Oh my word, I didn't know it was that long.
Yes, so anyway, as a process of doing this project, this was a National Historic Site. So
how did you get this job? What were you doing before that?
I was doing some genealogy and sewing, making quilts.
Well, I think there's more to this story because they didn't just say, she's a great quilter, let's have her work for NOVA.
No. My quilting had nothing to do with this.
I know, that's what I'm saying. Why did they choose you, do you think?
Well, my husband was the chief, now I brought his card because I know I wouldn't remember his title, the Chief Coastal Resource Coordinator Trustee for really the U.S. He had been assigned in different parts of the country, and he knew my capability in research. So he spread the word that I have somebody here that I know can take this on and do it for us. So I worked, with another department to get this done, and I had a university student that worked with me. And then as we got the collection much larger, an anthropologist from the university came on board to help with some of the history. That was really a team effort.
It sounds just like an amazing experience.
It was. That was a 24/7 job. You just didn't go to bed at night without thinking about it.
And you'd be ready the next morning.
So I was proud of the fact that I was able to from the research, trace back to present day descendants from the first Aleut fur seal manager. I found his living great-grandson and was able to do an oral interview of him and learn about some of the family lore and other examples like that. Once I started collecting information and getting material about the history, I said to who I was working for that I think it's important for me to focus on the people and less on the furs. And so that's the avenue I picked, so that one of the publications has to do with just the people that came and went and had an influence on these islands. Then the census records for the islands had been recorded yearly because it was a
Yearly?
Yes, it was a
That's very
federal
interesting.
reservation, so census were taken yearly, and these records I came upon in the archives, so I felt it was important to have them as part of the publication, as this really was an amazing thing that all of the natives there, a lot then were in Anchorage, there are a number here in Washington State, suddenly saw who like their grandfather really was, and it was really nice. I really felt
Very
good
rewarding,
about
then.
it. Yes, it was very rewarding.
Now, in that, you mentioned your husband. Can we find out a little bit about him and your life together?
Yes, John, my husband John, loved the sea, and he was exposed to ocean life as a young boy.
Where did he live?
He was in New Hampshire.
In New
His
Hampshire.
parents always brought them to the Maine coast every summer for at least 2 weeks, and he would spend his time in the tide pools looking at all the organisms and the small plant life. So he went to college and majored in zoology, and from there went on to do specifically that. He worked with microorganisms, the beginning of our food chain, identifying plants, and
Well, where did you two meet then?
well, we met when I was in college, the summer before my senior year. He was introduced to me, and that's how I met him. And we immediately went to the beach. So,
Which
yeah.
beach did you go to?
Well, Hampton Beach, I believe, yeah, Hampton Beach.
So after that, then what?
Oh, well, we married.
Not just after you got back from the beach.
No,
it was a little while longer.
Yes, we eventually married and lived in a small community that I taught school, and he was still finishing school. So
What
that
grade?
was the beginning of my influence into historical preservation. He really is the person that influenced me in that regard. Right across from our apartment was a tower with my mind is a Paul Revere bell.
Oh, really?
Rang and woke us up every morning.
You didn't need an alarm clock.
No, we didn't. We had a hobby of going and collecting bottles from old abandoned wells, and we would study maps.
How would you
where
get
they
them
had-
out of the wells?
Well, near a well, or where a house had been, an abandoned lot. And we joined the New England Bottle Club. That
sounds fun.
It was, and we learned a lot about history.
Did you get to keep your
doing
bottles, or
this.
did you donate
We
them?
did. We got to keep our bottles. And while I was teaching, in our science section of the class, I had them study about glass, and got into the subject of bottles and the history of bottles. And a number of students knew where there were places to go dig for bottles.
so did they tell
that
their
was part
teacher?
of it too.
What
So
kind of bottles
anyways,
did you find? How old were some
all
of them?
kinds. late 1800s. You're in New England now, so there's, and then clay pots. And if something was broken, you didn't discard it because it had a history to it. You had to see, you know, where was it.
When you say clay pots, were those Native American pots, or?
Well, the ones I found, no.
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 Okay.
No. So.
So where did you raise your family?
Well, my children were quite adaptive to moving because we moved
Oh, that's
17
good.
times, and
Why
they're
did you
growing
move
up
so
years.
much if he wasn't in the military?
Well, my husband contracted with, well, when he left college, he worked for a company doing scientific research that involved the effects of heated water from a power plant. So the companies he worked for before he started with NOAA all had some relationship with power plants.
Oh, so you had to go where the power plants were.
Yes.
Now, I want to not forget
But we kept going back to Durham.
Oh, that's where
Somehow we
that
made
was
our
your
way
place.
back to Durham. Yes.
Now, your grandmother was so interesting. I'd surely like to have you tell us about her.
Okay.
Could you
Yes.
pronounce her name? I do not want to make you laugh at my French.
No, that's okay. Gendreau. She was Edith Boucher Gendreau.
I remember the Boucher, but I got to Gendreau and I was
Yeah.
lost.
The Gendreau, my grandfather's mother was a Thibodeau. Okay, Gendreau is spelled Gendreau, but the census takers spelt it how it sounded, and the spelling of the name today is Jandreau. Like my name is Lozier in English, but it's Lozier in French. Just part of the name is the Roi de Jardin des Loziers, but that first section of the name got dropped over time. It's like a name evolved, like, yeah.
Or devolved.
Devolved, right.
Now, where did your grandmother live and what was...
Okay, my grandmother grew up in a small town along the St. John River on the Canadian side, and my grandfather was on the American side. But he was a lumberman, and the lumber company was in Canada. And at that time, there was no bridge. They used floating rafts to get across the river. And I'm not sure exactly how, oh yes, he met my grandmother through an uncle who had married her sister. But my grandmother grew up really in a situation where her father died when she was young, so all of the children were schooled away from home. And that's where she learned her hand skills. She could sew anything and crochet. She crocheted beautifully.
Did she teach you some of your skills?
Not physically, no. I think visually, yes.
Now, we haven't got too much time left, but could you tell quickly about your potato community? I read that at first you started, you got 10 buckets a day.
Yes, I need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes, growing up in that community of Aroostook County, all the schools in that county started early in August for 3 weeks and then let go for 3 weeks.
That was your potato week.
That was a potato week. Everyone picked potatoes, and you hired on. You had to call the farm that you wanted to pick for. They didn't come and search for you, but it was very competitive. By the time it got to be, I was in the 4th grade when I first started, so I had 3 older siblings that had they already knew where the good farm was and where the ones you didn't want to pick at because the soil was too wet and a lot of rotten potatoes in the field. Anyway, my first year I picked an average 10 barrels a day.
And by
the time I ended in my high school years, I could pick 100 barrels a day. So a barrel consisted of an average basket of 3.5. That's an adult size. But when you started as a young, yours basket was this big, and so it might have taken 8 of those to fill your barrel.
Well, it looks like your potato picking has served you well.
Yes,
And
yes, you learn, and that money you earned, you saved it, and some of it you used for special clothing if you wanted a special sweater or something. But basically, we were taught early on that your education was your key to your life.
and that
So
has been your whole life,
that's
hasn't it?
it, yes.
Well, you're an amazing woman. Is this,
Yes, I made this for our chapter. I thought would be a nice banner to hang at our meetings, and then I thought, well, why not use it here
well,
during our
it's
display?
beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Well, we've finished our interview, and I could talk to you all day. You've done so many things. And you started with your handicrafts.
I did. I'd like to just say one last thing about
Okay.
When my husband passed away 6 years ago. I didn't know what I was going to do with all of his clothes. He really had some nice things. He traveled a lot. We traveled together. So he had a ton of sweatshirts. And he came from a family where they collected. They were antiquers. So nothing got thrown out. So I said, well, one of my sisters sent to me a quilt that my grandmother had made that was a wedding quilt. And I looked at it, and it was just made up of pieces of fabric from clothing from the family, and that was the unique gift. You were giving that. So I says, well, you know what? I think I'm going to start making quilts for the family with his clothes, and that's what I've done. So I've made 6 T-shirt quilts, which I've passed to the grandchildren, and then 7 other quilts that are quite different, made with the fabric of his clothes.
Wow. So he lives on.
He lives on.
We need to make sure that gets into the thing, because it wasn't written on here, but I'm glad you told that. That is just a beautiful story.